Well, hey, good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Milliken, and welcome to the Poison Pen Bookstore. It's great to see you all out tonight, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jeffery Deaver back to the Poison Pen, as well as Chris Pavone. So, guys, you want to come on out? Here they come. Let's give them a nice warm welcome. Hi. Hi. All right. Well, Jeff's here to promote the first in a terrific new series called The Never Game, with a brand new protagonist named Coulter Shaw. And I have lots of questions about that. And Chris is here for The Paris Diversion, which, how many of you read his terrific Edgar-winning first book, The Expats? Lots of you.
Well, I've read that one too.
So what a thrill ride. They're both terrific books. And also, I understand you guys are going to be appearing in about a week together. So I'll largely stay out of the way and let you guys talk. But I do have questions. Let's start with you, Jeff. Tell us a little bit about this new protagonist of yours. He kind of reminded me a little bit of the Location Scout.
Sure. Well, thank you, Patrick. And interesting you mentioned that. Many years ago, I wrote a series, 3-book series called, they were the John Pelham books, the Location Scout series. And it was about an itinerant amateur detective, you might say, who worked for a film company and traveled around the country and would kind of stumble on crimes while he was looking for locations for his film company to shoot. And, if you ever get a casting call and someone wants you to be like Tom Cruise or Bruce Willis's sidekick, don't do it, because your time in that film is going to be quite limited. They're always the first to go. Well, what would happen with John Pelham was his sidekick would get murdered in the opening chapter or whatever. He'd stumble on a crime. And I loved the idea, and the books did well. There was an Edgar nomination for one, but the Hollywood aspect kind of limited what I could do. Hollywood is kind of, it's kind of goofy in a way. And if you've seen the Get Shorty TV show or the Get Shorty movie, we kind of chuckle at Hollywood. And I thought, well, I like the idea, but I wanted to take it out of the film context. And so what I did, let it sit for actually about 30 years, and came up with the idea of Coulter Shaw, who travels around the country in a Winnebago looking for rewards for missing people or for the police who've been unable to find an escaped convict or someone like that, and that's really where the book came from.
Right. I was interested that you mentioned that the kind of this, you're known for your masterful, intricate plots, and somewhere you mentioned that you kind of consciously adopted as what you call a streaming style to the book. Can you talk about that?
Sure. Well, we are all, Chris and I, and all authors nowadays are up against formidable cultural forms of competition. Angry Birds, Minecraft, Candy Crush, and it's true. We have so many more opportunities to be engaged in entertainment than we did when I started writing 35 years ago. I still feel, however, that a book is the most emotionally satisfying form of entertainment, because we look at, I love movies and paintings and music and so forth, but with a book, we're partners with the author, and that makes a lasting imprint with us. And we've lost readers. They've gone to Hulu, they've gone to Netflix, they've gone to video games and things like that. Well, I wanted to bring them back, so I had an idea, and I love Netflix like everyone else does, but I thought what I'd try to do is wean them off shows like that and bring them back to books by writing a book that's shorter than my usual books, less complicated, more linear, still twists and turns, shorter chapters, more dialogue, very staccato phrases. There's not a single word in the Never Game that you have to look up in a dictionary. And I have that complaint sometimes. I got a little fancy with my language. So I just want to, you heard it here first. I'm taking on Netflix. They're going down.
Now, Chris, tell us a little bit about, because there are people in here who have not read The Expats. Can you talk a little bit about kind of your inspiration for that first book, and then kind of how it continues into this new one?
Yeah, I don't know how I'm going to follow up Jeff Deaver going head to head with Netflix. I'm just writing novels, and I'm content with that. When I was 40 years old, my wife came home from the office one day and said, "What would you think of living in Luxembourg?" And by that point, we'd been married for 10 years, and I thought of myself as an honest person, and at that particular moment, I could not be completely honest with my wife of 10 years, and I said, maybe? I did not know exactly where Luxembourg was, and I was ashamed to admit it. I knew that it was somewhere in northwestern Europe, but it could have been a state in Germany. It could have been just a city. I didn't know that it was its own country, which it is. It's a grand duchy, which means that it's a country ruled by a grand duke, of which there's only one left in the world. It's not a terribly interesting place, but we moved abroad, and I left behind my career of 2 decades as a book editor and followed my wife's career to Europe, where I all of a sudden became somebody who no longer had a career and no longer had my friends and family and my identity. I lived in the same place for my whole life. My little brother had lived in China in the early 1990s, and I had never even seriously considered moving to the east side of Manhattan. And I felt that this was a huge, cowardly hole in my life experience that was now solved by my wife getting a job abroad. But what wasn't solved was I didn't know how to be a person without a job and without a career and without any friends. And I didn't know how to raise these children. We had 4-year-old twin boys at the time. I didn't speak French. I didn't know how to drive a car every day. I was crashing the car constantly. I was yelling at the children. I was burning all the food because all the appliances were in German, and it's surprisingly difficult to translate appliances because a lot of the words are not things that you could just find in the dictionary. I also didn't really understand German dictionaries, frankly, which are not as straightforward as you might think. So I started writing a book called The Expats about this experience. And after a few months of working on this book, in 100+ pages, I realized that I was writing a book filled with complaints about burning the chicken and yelling at children. And it was not a very good book. And after a few decades in publishing, I understood that it's important for the book to not be horrible. So I stopped the book I was working on, and I took a deep breath for a few months and thought, what type of book can you write here? What's the plot going to be? What's the thing that you can deliver to the world that the world wants to hear? What do you like to read? And I've been writing a book that was just sort of blah, 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 nothing, expats, bored. And I discovered that I wanted to really write a spy novel. I wanted to write a spy novel about a marriage where both parties were lying to each other about the most fundamental things. And after writing that first book, I decided I want to write other books about the same exact thing. They're not the same book, and they're very different plots, but they all revolve around this thing that I think is the most compelling thing about spy fiction and why I love John le Carré, why I love spy novels to begin with, because they're premised around dishonesty within intimate relationships. And I think that's so powerful and so relatable. And they're the stories I love to read, and now they're the stories that I love to write.
It's funny, I was going to ask, what was your inspiration for Kate? Was there a particular kind of operative? But now I'm hearing that you were the inspiration for Kate in some ways. She's a fascinating character, very kind of nuanced. And what I was going to ask you, it's funny. Have you know who Stella Remington is?
Oh yeah, sure.
Director, was it MI5
Yep.
or MI6? One of the most interesting programs I was kind of given the opportunity to do was Stella Remington. Here's a woman who rose up through the ranks of British intelligence in a very male-dominated culture, and she came in, no bodyguard, no nothing, and at least that I saw. She was probably what
I saw the drones over there.
Yeah, the drones. This may have been pre-drone, but she talked a lot about her life and this kind of need to sort of compartmentalize things in her life, and you see that a lot in the book. And can you talk a little bit about that? How she, who inspired Kate?
Well, I inspired Kate, but I think this is a hard thing to do for everybody, and not just protagonists in thrillers. But how do you go about life being both the person who's a parent or a spouse or a good friend or son or a daughter and also be somebody who has to do really questionable things for a living. And I think it's very rare that you get to go through an entire career and not have to do something questionable. And obviously there's a big continuum of what you have to do, but the job that I ended up quitting, my last job in publishing, I hated so much because I had to fire people. And I had to fire people so that my boss could make more money, and he already had enough money. And I felt so bad about this aspect of needing to go through life doing this really grown-up thing that I'm sure most of the people in this room have done, which is to go into work and fire somebody simply because somebody better could do that job, not because the world was depending on it, but just because that's how capitalism works. And I felt so crappy about that. And I think I wanted to communicate in all of these books, but especially in Kate Moore's predicament, what's it like to have to do really, really crappy things, and then to go home and still be a parent, and still be a spouse, and still be good.
And it's funny, both of the books, I was looking for a couple of through lines between your books, and they're there. They're both real, tightly paced, sort of race against the clock structured. But they're also both dealing with this world that technology has wrought in some ways. Jeff, in your new book, you go into the dark underbelly of video games, and there's a what is it called? The role-playing games, multiple. Can you talk about that?
Massive multiplayer online role-playing games.
Right.
I've written about technology, and some of you know some of my books like Data Mining and The Broken Window, and The Blue Nowhere was about a hacker who used a thing called a modem to hack into that funny noise they made. I'll tell you where the idea for the video games came about probably 4 years ago. I was visiting my family, and my adorable little 9-year-old niece said, "Uncle Jeff, let's play video games." And I said, "Well, honey, I don't really know much about them." And she said, "That's okay, I'll show you." And so she had, of course, she's 9 years old, so she has the most sophisticated smartphone that they make, and I had whatever I had, or an early Apple or whatever. And so, she had me download the game, and we would go online and select the Wi-Fi thing, so we can play, and we kind of see each other in the game. And I say, "So how do we play? What do we do next?" And she says, "Well, you die." And she pulled out, her little avatar pulled out a sword and killed me in like 4 seconds. I was a little peeved, I was a little cross, because she hadn't laid out the ground rules yet. But then it was Minecraft, by the way. And you think Minecraft is there are 2 forms. One is creative, where you join together, and there's rainbows and harmony, and you build things together. And then there's survival, where you just stab your uncle to death in 4 seconds. And then we laughed and we went on to play, and I found it quite interesting. But I thought right there, now what I want to do is write a book at some point in which, and I didn't know anything about games at that point, but I started to research it, and I said, well, what I want to have happen is a villain to become, or appear to become, obsessed with a real video game. In the book, in the Never game, I made up a game, but it was kind of credible. It's like an action adventure game that is typical of him. But this character, the villain, starts mimicking in the real world the game, and he really takes it into the real life. And people, to survive this game, have to kind of play along. And Coulter Shaw, my new hero, who knows nothing about video games either, he says, to the police who think this girl has just run off, my first apparent victim, he says, no, there's something weird going on here. And he gets involved in the video gaming world, and so he then has to kind of become a gamer himself, working with people in the industry to think ahead and find out what this villain is up to.
Sorry, I want to jump in with a question for you. How did you make up the video game? How much research did you do into figuring out what that was going to be? I read this book about 6 months ago, and one of the things that still sticks with me now is how many facts there were in this book about so many different things. And I was thinking, as I was reading this, does Jeff Deaver really play role-playing games? Like, how do you know this stuff?
Yeah, first of all, I'm so traumatized about my niece, I'll never go back to playing games again. But I did research, Chris, like you did. I mean, we both do a great deal of research. But I have to say, I kind of worked backwards. I had the premise that I wanted Coulter to have to get into this video gaming world, and I wanted a game that was a credible action-adventure game, the sort that people would really play, but I wanted it to serve my purposes because it's my world, and I wanted it to be, I wanted to help my plot along. So the game that I made up is called The Whispering Man, and the premise is quite simple. In the game, now this is the thing you put the disc in, well, I don't think they do that anymore, but you download and play on your computer. It's a first-person game, and the screen goes black, and you see this character, this kind of eerie character walk up to you, the screen goes black, and then you wake up, the screen comes to life again, and you're in an abandoned factory, or on a sinking ship, or in a cave, and you have 5 things with you, 5 objects. Could be a fishing line, could be a wrench, could be a cigarette lighter, or something like that. And you have to use those things to escape before he or someone else, it's an online game, come up and kill you. Or you may form alliances with people and put your 5 things together so you have 10 things. And then it just seemed like a great vehicle for me to some extent explore the gaming world, but mostly move my plot along, because the 5 things were clues, the locations were clues, and I'm still, thinking maybe I should have done a first-person shooter game, but those are just kind of violent for the sake of violence. So I was happy the way the game turned out, and I'm still waiting for somebody like Blizzard to call me up and say, Jeff, here's $1 million. We want your game.
There are provocative questions that you put out there to the reader. Like, what kind of conclusions did you draw after going into that underbelly of the video game world? Is it an addiction? Is it does it lead to violence? There are all kinds of questions that people ask about these games.
Yeah. Well, Ernest Hemingway said, if you want to send a message, go to Western Union. And now, I tell that to the students in my class, and some are of the age where they know what Western Union was, and most of them are like, huh? And, I'd say, rather, if you want to send a message, Ernest Hemingway would say, put it on Twitter or on Facebook. But I do raise those exact questions, Patrick, and I'm not going to go into it now. I have some conclusions, but I want you, when you close the last page of the book, to think, okay, well, I hope you enjoyed the story itself, but maybe you'll think about video games. Maybe you'll think there are some good sides, and they actually are very beneficial health aspects and psychological aspects to games, and then there are some very dark sides. I want you to think about them.
Right. Now, Chris, let's talk a little bit about the new book specifically. There's so much going on in this book. It's a book about, I was thinking it's very much a book about Paris, obviously, because of the title, but old Paris meets new Paris, and we're talking a little bit about technology, which has a huge role in this book. It's told from multiple viewpoints as we go through the book. Very challenging setup. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, first of all, it's not homework. I don't know about challenging. It's a strange thing. It's a book about terrorism that takes place in Paris, except it came out of my experiences living downtown in New York in 2001. I suffer from seasonal allergies, and so on September 10th, 2001, I took a Benadryl before I went to bed, and so I woke up late. My wife was already gone, and I was aiming to leave the apartment by 8:45 in the morning. If I did that, I would be at my desk by 9:15, which I thought was good enough, and I was 1 minute late. So it was 8:46 when I bent down to tell my dog, Charlie Brown, what a good boy he was, and something really loud went zooming past the window that sounded exactly like the bad thing that's about to happen to Wile E. Coyote in The Roadrunner. It was and then there was no explosion at the end, and I stood up and I looked to where the noise came from, the windows that faced the river, and I didn't see anything. And then I turned around and I looked to the south, and that's when I saw. And this was a pretty bad apartment. It had a crappy kitchen, it had a crappy bathroom that made you feel like you were bathing inside some type of Neolithic jade vase. But what it had that was terrific is this was a real New York City loft whose corner room, big room, was dominated by giant windows through which you could only see one thing. And that was the World Trade Center, side by side, taking up your entire field of vision. I would just sit there on my couch and stare at them, awestruck at what this was. And I grew up in New York City. these were built when I was a little kid. They defined New York in the 1970s. And here I was looking at a hole in one of them. And I was still looking at that window when the second plane hit, which was the first time that day I thought I was going to die. The second time that day I thought I was going to die was when the building started coming down, and briefly I had no idea what was happening. Whether I-beams or huge chunks of concrete or the entire building was going to come hurtling through my window or through my ceiling. The buildings were 900 feet away, and they were 1,500 feet tall. If they toppled over like trees, lumberjack, they would fall on me. And I picked up Charlie Brown, and we ran into that ugly green bathroom, and we hid in there until the building stopped shaking and something broke that sounded like a wine glass dropped at a party. And I went out to an apartment that had no lights on because it was a beautiful day, and it was almost completely dark, and I couldn't see anything. The thing that had broken was a picture had fallen off the wall. I waited and waited and waited to see across the street. 15, 20 minutes went by. I could see across the street, then I could see a block away, and then I could see that there was only one Twin Tower left. And eventually, I left the building that day with the intention of coming back tomorrow. Didn't realize that I wouldn't be allowed home for a month. When we eventually did move home, it was to a neighborhood that was pinned into 12,000 new feet of chain link fence that we needed to enter through checkpoints that were manned by the National Guard, carrying assault rifles and wearing flak jackets. And this was where we lived. The stench never stopped. The stadium lights all through the night, the noise of earth movers. We lived in what looked like a war zone, and it looked permanent. Those towers, those piles of rubble, were not extinguished for 100 days. And meanwhile, we were living 3 blocks away. And terrorism looked to me permanent. It looked like this is just where I live now, in this horrible place. And New York was so different then. It was so strange, it was so scary. Every time a truck rumbled by, people thought, oh my God, here it is, the next thing. Because we absolutely knew that something next was coming, and it might be that noise right now. And you know that it wasn't, but that didn't make us not know it then. We were just wrong. And slowly this faded until 2016 when I went to Paris, which is a few days after 80 people were killed in Nice on Bastille Day by a truck, and it was the year after the Bataclan attacks and the massacre at Charlie Hebdo. And I'd been to Paris maybe 10 times in the previous decade. And as soon as I stepped off the subway in downtown Paris, I thought, oh my God, this place feels exactly like New York in 2001. And I felt a brand new kinship with these people, and I felt like Paris was this really familiar thing to me, this strange familiar thing of a big city in the grip of terrorism. And I really wanted to write a book about that. I never wanted to write a 9/11 novel based on New York. A lot of people had done that. There's been a lot of exploitation of that particular tragedy and grief that I didn't want to participate in. But still, it was a singular moment in my life, this terrorist event that I lived through, that I wanted to somehow use. And I found a way to use it by moving it to Paris.
And in so doing, you really challenged the reader's assumptions about what is terrorism, who is behind this, and can you talk a little bit about that?
Completely. I mean, I think we're all very familiar with this, and this is why I wrote this particular terrorism novel instead of the one that you've seen 50 times before in TVs and movies and in books, which is a North African man wearing a suicide vest arrives at the largest museum in the world. And I think you as a reader know exactly what's going to happen in this story, and that's exactly what does not happen. And I wanted to use terrorism, which is the certainty. I think this is the power of terrorism, that after it's happened, you then know, you're convinced as a population that it will happen again, and it might be happening right now. And we get so accustomed to that and so ready for it to happen. And that expectation of terror is as much what this book is about as real terror. That's the power of terrorism, that it leads you to expect it even when it's not coming. And in this book, people use it.
To lighten things up, let's talk about hashtag mom.
Yes, hashtag mom. I hate social media, I have to admit. I don't like what it's done to the world. I don't like what it's done to our politics. It looked briefly like something that was going to change the world for the best, and I think that it has not, and I think it's changed the way we live for the worse. And I wanted to poke some fun at that. And I didn't want to do it a lot, and I didn't want to do it constantly, but there's a particular type of hashtag that I can't stand, and it fills up my feed of other parents I know. I've been very active in schools, and I know a lot of people who are similarly active in parenting, and there's a certain degree of competitive parenting that goes on that I simply can't stand. And there are a lot of people who hashtag things that just make me want to explode at the end of their posts, and those things are so blessed and things like that. So blah 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 blah. I think of them in my brain as hashtag smug. And so hashtag mom here, who is what Kate refers to a woman who ends every post with the same hashtag, is a character. Hey, are there recipes here?
Yeah. Yes.
You don't have these.
By the
other
way,
shows.
everybody who, I should have mentioned this before. Everybody who bought actually either one of their new books will have a neat little insert of some sort, including, let's see,
This
we have a Coco
this
Van
possibly
recipe.
sounds preposterous. So it will make sense if you read the book. This is a recipe for Coco Van, which I hope you'll cook.
Yeah, well,
Not-
that's one of my
not-
signature dishes.
Oh, you
Yeah.
already-
I use
you already have
I
a
make
recipe.
Coco Chambertin with the dark wine, you know,
Oh wow!
the red.
You don't use any
red burgundy.
cheap Burgundy.
Yeah,
So
one for the dish, one for me. One for the dish, one for me.
I was a cookbook editor for a long time, and I really love cooking. And I've spent basically a year trying to perfect a given dish that people really like. And a few years ago, the dish that I spent a year perfecting was coco van. It was based on a recipe that I edited from one of my favorite projects ever, the Balthazar cookbook, which I published in I think 2002. And this is a strangely enough relevant recipe for the plot of the Paris Divergent. And to explain more would really be ludicrous. So you'll just have to trust me that it's there.
And there's also a really great map of Paris that shows you a lot of the events that take place in the book. And I'm kind of at a challenge here because in Jeff's new book, there's a really great interview in here, a conversation about inspiration for culture shock. So I'm trying not to repeat the same questions, although there's some good ones in here. And I wanted to ask you a little bit. You mentioned, some of your role models for the book, and you were attracted to the kind of itinerant, like Travis McGee and James Bond and people like that. There's also his background. With Jeff's book, we can't really say much. I can't really give away too much. But the Culture Shaw's backstory is very interesting. Can you talk about his father?
Sure. And I'll preface this by saying, I see many familiar faces out there, and I'm a plot-driven author. I've talked about this. I do the long outlining. Everything's very choreographed, and so I have to say, character and setting have become a bit secondary to me. But I read something within the last month that I found quite enlightening. That the portion of our brain, and there may be neuroscientists or psychologists out here who are familiar with this, but the portion of our brain that creates connection with real human beings, our friends, family, and enemies and bad people too, but it creates an emotional connection, is identical, or I should say it's the same portion of the brain that creates connections with fictional characters. That's why our kids were so in love with Harry Potter, because Harry Potter was real to them. It's like when I read Jack Reacher. Jack Reacher is real to me. I don't want anything to happen to him, for instance. And so I spent a little more time in crafting this book, actually the next book, because I just read about this recently, in creating a little more depth to the characters. Now, Coulter has an interesting backstory. His father was a brilliant professor at an unnamed school in San Francisco Bay. It's really Berkeley, but I don't mention it. I don't want the lawyers involved. And his father, however, made a discovery. Now, we don't, in the Never game, know what the discovery is, but apparently he discovered the wrong thing, or the wrong people learned about what his discovery was, and he felt his family was in peril. So he moved to the Sierra Nevada mountains on a compound and learned survivalism. And he taught his children how to survive in all contexts. Now, there's a continuum of survivalists. There are wackos. There are people who believe that the aliens from planet Xantar are going to come down and mind meld with us. And then there are certainly misogynist, racist, ultra right-wing neo-Nazis who are going to are ready for the takeover, and they're going to fight back. But then there are simply people who want to be self-sufficient. And one of Ashton Shaw, that's Colter Shaw's, his father, one of his philosophies of life was Ralph Waldo Emerson, self-reliance. He said, I'm going to teach you kids to, whatever happens, you're going to be able to survive. If anything happens to me, and it very well may, you're going to have to fend for yourself. So I gave him what I hope Colter Shaw was the depth of that survival training, made him a classic hero so that he now knows these techniques. Now, my idea of survivalism, I'm sitting on the back porch, my wine gets a little warm, I have to stand up, walk over my dogs to go into the refrigerator and refresh it. That's kind of my idea of how to survive in the world. So all of that was researched, I have to say. And, I used to hike and fish a little bit when I was young, and then I learned you could drink white wine and sit on the back porch. It was much easier to do. But I wanted to give Colter that kind of, he's kind of an alternative sort of character, but nonetheless he's a hero. He's the strong, silent type. There's not a lot of gunplay in the book. There's a scene near the beginning where he confronts a bad guy. And he's just, we know he's a bad guy because he's got my hairstyle with a ponytail. And right away, if anybody here is bald and has a ponytail, forgive me. But but he's going to do something bad. And so Colter Shaw thinks, okay, I know what to do now. He reaches for his weapon, and we learn that it's the weapon he uses almost all the time when he's confronting a bad guy, and he pulls out his iPhone and calls 911. Not to say he's not involved in fisticuffs at some point, and there's a little bit of gunplay, but mostly he's the kind of character that we would want on our side, because he's real, he's calm, he's has a bit of a sense of humor. And so I was very happy to create a guy that I would like to sit down and have a beer with. Unlike, frankly, Lincoln Rhyme, who's a bit of a curmudgeon, and I don't think I'd like to lift a pint with him.
Well, it's funny. How many of you are Lincoln Rhyme fans? All right. Have you guys heard the news about the new television series? Can you tell us anything about it?
Sure. The movie The Bone Collector came out 20 years ago this year. Oh my gosh, a long time ago. And Hollywood is a curious phenomenon, as I was mentioning earlier. We've been trying to get a TV show made for years. There was some litigation, I think you may have asked me that. There was litigation going on between Universal Pictures, which was the initial production company, and I think Sony Pictures, that apparently got worked out because about 4 months ago, my sister called me up. My sister, I've mentioned, my young adult writer sister, and said, Jeffrey, I'm a little angry, good-naturedly, because how come I'm reading about NBC making a series of The Bone Collector and you didn't tell me? I said, because I didn't know. I called my agent. He didn't know. The way the arrangement worked was that it was a buyout 20 years ago. They had no obligation to tell me anything. They're not paying me anything for it because it was a buyout back then. Maybe a tweet might have been nice, or even we'll invite you to the set to observe, but haven't heard any of that. But it doesn't matter. Why? Because NBC is doing a series of based on the Bone Collector called Lincoln, because it's based not just on the Bone Collector, but about aspects of all 11 books, starring Russell Hornsby, a great actor, and my all-time casting coup is Michael Imperioli, who plays Lincoln Rhyme's friend Lon Solito, partner Lon Solito, and Michael was, of course, the Chris Moldesani in The Sopranos, a great actor. And but again, I have to call my sister up, who follows all the trade press, and say, so what's happening with it now? So it is going to series. It will be airing in mid-season. Probably later the fall. We don't have any dates yet, but I'm going to encourage all of you to go online, because the more Arbitron, do they do Arbitron anymore? Do they do that? It's like the rating service. Well, it doesn't matter, because if you've got cable TV, they know exactly what you're watching at all time. They know when you go get a beer and when you go to the restroom. That's what the data mining is all about. So they will know you're watching Lincoln, and so that means you all have to watch Lincoln. And I thank you in advance.
Now, Chris, with Kate Moore, I keep going back to her. She's such a fascinating protagonist. If you haven't read her, pick up The Expats. You'll love it. Tell us a little bit about kind of the trade craft in the book and sort of researching. She's the head of. Would it be accurate to say she's kind of the head of station for a division of the CIA in Pali?
Yes, she's the head of a small mini station that operates outside of the purview of the CIA. And I did a tremendous amount of research over the past decade into what agency operatives' lives are like, reading a lot of memoirs and also a lot of fiction. And just the other night in Washington, after my book event of Politics and Prose, I had dinner with 5 people, and 2 of them were ex-CIA operatives who now write novels. And both of them recognize this essential truth that I know and that a lot of people miss, which is that although my books have the backbone of being spy novels, there's almost no specific information in them at all about being in the CIA. So and this is true of a lot of the research I do. I research and I research and I research, and then I write a whole bunch of stuff because I did the research, and I want to take that week that I spent reading those 3 books and turn it into something. And so I turn it into 3 or 4 pages, and then a month or 2 later, when I'm reading the whole thing, I read those 3 or 4 pages, and I say to myself, you know what? None of that belongs in this book, and I take out everything except a sentence. I don't like filling my books with research, and the main thing that I've gotten out of all the research about CIA assets and officers is that it's hard to be dishonest to people all the time, and that's the fundamental thing that I want to write about in these books. Not so much the tradecraft, of which there's some, there's not none, but it's just not the backbone of the stories. I think whereas Jeff is extremely plot driven, I'm extremely character driven, and although I have plots, I don't have facts. So I don't want to overburden you, the reader, with excessive amounts of information that you could read in somebody's memoir. That's not what I'm trying to accomplish.
The couple, her husband Dexter, Kate's really the professional in this relationship, and he's kind of portrayed anyway as sort of an amateur, somewhat of slippery, character. Yet the relationship seems to endure and work. I really like that about the books. And what I wanted to ask you is, are you sympathetic to Dexter?
I'm very sympathetic to Dexter, who had a career that in tech that didn't quite work out. And I think we're sort of used to the story of the careers in tech that did work out, because there are a lot of those stories and are famous, and a lot of those people have their so-called liquidity events at which they buy airplanes and things like that. But there are also a lot of people who work in tech who got absolutely nowhere and who made one wrong decision and foundered in this career that looked so appealing. And I think, to me, there's something eminently sympathetic about somebody who looks like they should have had a successful career and then didn't, and then finds himself, as Dexter does, in his mid-40s, on his 3rd career really, hoping that this one sticks. And he's had more success in this, which is day trading, which also looks like the type of thing that when you hear about people being very successful at it, you hear, of course, about the huge successes. You don't hear about the millions of people sitting around in their living rooms trying to trade every day and ending up on the year up $12. And Dexter had some good years, but currently he's having, as most people do, I certainly did last year, a really horrible year in the stock market.
Could you talk a little about Forsyth? I mean, he's a
I thought you were going to ask me if could I talk a little bit more about my stock
I want you to give me some advice, 'cause I'll bet my year was worse than your year. We'll compare that later.
Hunter Forsyth is a tech CEO, founder and CEO in this book, who is about to make a huge deal that's going to take him from being just normal, everyday, flying first class rich to having your own plane rich. And this is one of my characters, and I have a few of them in every book that I've written, who are people who, A, I dislike so much it's unbelievable, and B, who I nevertheless model on parts of me that I dislike about myself. And I feel like writing characters I don't like is one of the favorite things that I do. I get to take parts of me that I don't like, and I try to make them sympathetic but also hateable. And I think that's maybe that's a hard thing to do, but it's also really fun. And I'm not going to tell you whether it happens in this book or not, but one of the joys about creating hateable characters is you get to kill them. And you know, you don't, but we do, and it's incredibly enjoyable.
He was also multi-dimensional. I mean, he was, I felt for him in many ways.
He's a guy who has been given everything in the world and yet refuses to see the things that are not his, and thinks that because he's been given everything, because he has a lot, that he's entitled to absolutely everything. And he's of a breed, I don't actually know many Silicon Valley tech people. I know a lot of New York City people like this though, who once they have a lot, they think that they're entitled to everything else too. And I really loathe those people. And when I eventually leave New York City for good, it's going to be because I can no longer stand being in restaurants with those people.
Yeah, he has a wonderful, I guess you'd call it assistant, but she really has a lot of power, named Colette. Great character, didn't you think so?
Thank you.
Colette, yeah.
Colette, whose name used to be something else until I had somebody who I've known for a long time, when she first started reading my manuscripts, I would never have referred to her as this, but there's a new phrase in book publishing called authenticity readers. Authenticity readers read manuscripts in early stages when the author wants to make sure that when I want to make sure that I'm not writing something that's going to be incredibly offensive to people who I would not have seen offending. And this woman, Layla Demey, reads my manuscripts for my French authenticity. And at first she was reading just to make sure that my French wasn't horrible. But in this book she also pointed out that the character's name that I was calling Inez, and she said this in such a great French fashion that made me just love all French people for this. She said, a woman like this would never be named Inez. Jamais. And I said, well, it's a name. And she said, no, you were completely wrong. She gave me a list of other names. Here are your possibilities. Here are the 5 names that this character should be named. And I was so blown over by her certainty that Inez was so wrong. And she was telling me there are no women of this age named Inez who were born in Paris. And I was about to say, but I know one, when I realized that I would only lose the battle more if I was buttressed by facts on my side. So Colette is now her name. And Colette sees the world much more clearly than her boss does. And part of what's going on, and these are incredibly minor characters in this book, only appear in maybe 1/10 of the chapters, but their relationship is integral to the outcome of the plot.
Now, Jeff, at the end of this book, we're left in which we can't say anything about, I might add. You leave your character in a very interesting place. Do you have I'm sure you do have plans for the next book.
Oh yeah, before I came over here, I did some media this morning, the satellite radio, where you talk about yourself. Tough job, but somebody's got to do it for about 4 hours straight. That's why my voice is a little off tonight. But after that, I sat down at my computer and got about 5 hours of the new book. And it has a title, I can't tell you that. It has a plot, I can't tell you that. It does have Culture Shaw in it, but it is a springboard. The final pages of the Never Game are a springboard into this book, because my approach is that although they will appear every year, although I will have a caveat there. The book after the next Culture Shaw. So we have Culture Shaw this year, Culture Shaw next year, Lincoln Rhyme after that, a Culture Shaw after that. They're going to follow one right after the other. So there will not be a year break in between them. It will just be continuous. So I'm not really aging him much. I kind of like that conceit. We don't really deal with world events. So if something happens significantly in the world, I'm not going to bring that in. He's in his own little, fairly well-sealed world. Yes, but the next book follows on from the end of that.
I was going to ask you, you're also a prolific short story writer. You've got how do you make it all work? What's your routine like? Do you have a certain number of pages you shoot for every day, or?
No, I enjoy writing so much. When I teach my courses, I'll have students come up to me and say, Mr. Deaver, I want to write, but I just can't find the time. And I'm as sympathetic as I can be, and I encourage them and tell them, pick an hour here, an hour there. And then I have students come up to me and say, my life's a mess. I'm not getting the homework done. I forget to pick up the kids at school. I show up late for work. All I do is write. They're the ones who are going to be the writers, of course. And I fall into that last category. So I look forward to it so much. Now, I don't know how you feel with this, but novels are, I love writing, but it's a chore. It's kind of a backbreaking chore for me. Short stories are my junk food. I can write a short story in like 3 or 4 days, and they all have sick and twisted endings. You don't have to create sympathetic characters. You can have the most despicable human beings on earth, but as long as there's a good twist, the readers will follow you because they don't have a big emotional investment in this. It's all about the drop of the parachute on the amusement part. But I enjoy writing those. And I do about four or five a year. I'll have my 4th collection come out probably later in the year. And there's an interesting phenomenon that's happening now in this world of electronic publishing, that the publishing companies initially will take a short story, and there's a short story based on Colter Shaw that I wrote a little while ago, and my publisher Putnam offered it as a electronic, I think a giveaway. I don't think you have to pay for it. If you pay for it, I don't get anything. They haven't told me about that part. But then it will be in the you'll have an opportunity to buy it in paper form when it comes out in the anthology. So the short stories are sort of, I guess you'd call them a little teaser to get you into the new books. So I'm doing a couple of those, writing another one, Lincoln Rhyme short story, 2 Colter Shaw short stories, and then just a plain sick and twisted short story just for the fun of it, where nobody survives the end. It's great.
Chris, I was going to ask you a little bit about boy, I just completely lost my train of thought there. You were an editor for many, many years, for 20 years, and we had an author last week named Hillary Davidson, who writes a prolific nonfiction writer and has a new novel out that's really great. But she made an interesting point about how the nonfiction editorial side of her brain is very different than the creative fiction writing side. And when you kind of moved from those two careers, editorial to writing your own creative work, what was that like for you? Do you agree that it's sort of a different part of the brain, or do you see them as all connected?
The making up of stories is obviously very different, but the work of being careful and deliberate about writing, which I think is what separates everybody who's good at this from everybody who's not. That's the same in nonfiction and fiction, is that if you take it very, very seriously, and you take it all very seriously, and I don't just mean the plot and the major strokes of character, but every sentence and every vocabulary choice, even if what you're doing is making the choice to not have any vocabulary choices that are going to require anybody to look anything up in the dictionary, that's a deliberate choice, and it's not necessarily an easy thing to do. That it's all part of being specific about trying to accomplish something and knowing what that is and working really, really hard at it. And I'm in awe of this guy's work ethic, which I frankly do not remotely share. I've never written for 5 hours in a day, much less in a hotel room. That's not how I'm going about my life, but I'm also, I'm not nearly as prolific as him, and you cannot find me anywhere near the top of the bestseller list where all of his books go. I mean, he is a master, and there are very few people who are great at writing a book every year and having those books be consistently terrific. And you may look around and think that there are hundreds of these people, because there are hundreds of people, if not thousands, who publish a book every year. But if you take a look at how many of those books are actually great, you can probably count those people on both your hands. It's not that many. And I don't know where you get that skill, and it's probably also a great deal of practice and not just skill or talent or whatever you call the thing that you just have. But he's obviously been working at it for a long time and working at it very diligently. And I think that's true in nonfiction and fiction, in any writing. All the best of it comes from really, really working very hard.
Is it Malcolm Gladwell, the 10,000 hours or whatever it is that if you practice, those who achieve a certain level of success, they practice over and over.
Yeah, and that's he wrote a long thing about this, and Malcolm Gladwell also said something fascinating a few years ago. I was not in the room for this, but he was addressing the Association of American Publishers, which is a trade organization of American publishers. And my wife works in publishing, most of our friends work in publishing. At the time, I did not have a job in publishing. I was not in this room, but at least 100 people were in this room. I've never met Malcolm Gladwell. He just finished reading The Expats. He pointed out that this book, obviously a great many people, and not just the author, spent a lot of time making into the best book that it can be and publishing it well. And he's convinced, and he's a guy who reads a thriller every week. He writes a lot of other stuff, but what he does in his spare time is just read thrillers. He reads a constant diet of them. That the world is not looking, readers are not looking for more books. There are enough books out there. What everybody is looking for, including him, are better books. And better books only come from really hard work.
Let's open up the floor to questions from the audience. Do you guys have questions? That's what I was afraid of.
Hi. Thank you both for being here. My question is for Jeff. You both have mentioned a lot of research that you've done for your books, and some of them have acknowledgments like to lieutenants and police chiefs and those types of people. But I wanted to ask you about the unsubs and the villain or the bad guys, and what kind of research, if any, you've done for them. Have you interviewed convicts, or it just comes from your creative mind?
In my case, it comes from my sick and twisted creative mind. I've spoken to a lot of law enforcement people. I don't think I've ever actually interviewed someone who was on the other side of the law, although I have talked to them and met them occasionally. You know, we may all have had friends who maybe have done time for one thing or another, generally fairly minor offenses, and then moved on with their life and kind of left that behind them. I will tell you one story though. So in answer to your question, I basically make it up. It's my job to kind of sit in a dark room, close my eyes, and imagine what I think will make a credible villain. But I got a fan letter one time from a fellow on death row, actually, in Texas, and he said, "Mr. Deaver, we read your books in prison there and I'll make a deal with you. If you can put in a good word to the governor for me, write a letter on my behalf. I will, because I'm innocent, totally innocent. I'll tell you the best ways to actually kill somebody." Well, I'm thinking, how does he know that if he's completely innocent? And I've gotten a few other letters from people not on death row, but in prison occasionally. No, frankly, a lot of them are just kind of crazy and scary. The letters don't make a lot of sense, but I don't really have much, I don't really need to do a lot of research in that regard. Well, how about you, Chris? When you come up with the bad guys?
I've already explained, the bad guys are all me.
Yeah, oh, that's true. Should I move a little further away from you? Thank you.
Well, I guess then I'll just tell you someone else doesn't have a question. Is there's something about them that I kind of like, and I'm sorry that sounds really odd, and I think this is being recorded too, so at least the camera can't see my face. But they're smart and they're calculated and they plan things out, and so there's a little something about them you can find.
Actually, I was joking around a little bit, but it's a very good point. Every character in the book has to resonate. The villain is the hero of his or her own story. When in my books, I want to give them that little element that, we don't want them to succeed in the assassination attempt or killing the victim, but I want the readers to feel bad for them that they don't succeed, because that gives it some depth. That makes a realistic situation. So I don't create black and white characters. I don't want someone to be completely good or completely bad, and I think that adds to the emotional resonance of the story.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, I kind of have two, if that's okay.
Go for it.
I was just wondering who your favorite character to write is, and also you mentioned writing for 5 hours. So, on average, how many hours do you think go into one book?
Sure. Well, for my answer is the way I work is a little bit different. I outline all my books ahead of time. So I'll answer your second part. And the question was, how do you divide up your time during the day to write a book? Or is that sort of what you were asking?
Well, how many hours total? You mentioned that you sat down and wrote for 5 hours,
Mhm.
and I just, on average, like hundreds,
Okay.
thousands.
All right, sure.
Yeah.
The way I write a book is I do an outline. I spend 8 months doing an outline of the book, and that's my full-time job. I do research at the same time. I don't write a single word of the prose for that 8 months. Maybe, 7, sometimes a little longer than 8 months. And the Never Game, the outline was about 150 pages long. And that has every element of the plot. I have 3 plots going on at once. All the clues. I know when all the characters are introduced into the book. I know when they leave the book. And I do it doesn't come that easily to me. I have to you start with Post-it notes, and it's a kind of an organic process. It takes me a long time to get that done. When that is finished, I know exactly how the book is going to go. I can write it in any order. So, and I can sit down and write as long as I can sit in a chair, basically, until it gets just irritating to me. So I can write. I have written, because there's no writer's block then. The block came when I was doing the outline. When that's done, I know where the story's going to go. So I can sit down, and I have written 10,000 words in one day. It's 10 hours, 10 hours. I take breaks, of course. And then there have been days when I don't write at all. I may do interviews, I may do some research and so forth. So in my case, there really isn't a set page count. But people who do, the phrase pantser, there's the plotters and then the pantsers, as in seat of the pants. I was talking to Lee Child, and he doesn't outline. He just sits down, and his wonderful Jack Reacher books just come out with his brilliant mind. I can't work that way. And so he might very well, his answer might be, who knows what, 2,000 words a day or something like that. I don't really know. So I'm a bit of an anomaly there. And as far as my favorite character, I don't know. I don't have a favorite. I kind of like them all.
Did you have an answer to that, Chris? Anything about like your daily working habits?
I would be curious myself.
Do you outline? I outline, but I outline once I've started writing a little bit. I outline when I know where the story's going, and then I revise the outline a lot. My outline though is at the end is at most 3 pages. I don't outline like that. If I have 60 chapters or 70 chapters, each chapter is represented on my outline by one line. That's
A bullet point or something.
A bullet point, exactly. But I also, I think to me the hard part is figuring out what's going to happen. That's the part that hurts the brain. And then the typing of 100,000 words is relatively easy and much more fun to me than figuring out of what's going to happen in this book. What are the plot twists are going to be? How are the reveals going to be revealed, and why and when? And that whole thing of figuring out what are all the twists and what is this plot and how do the different plot elements, that's not, in a way, that's almost not writing, because there's no typing involved in that. That's just waking up, for me, at 3 o'clock in the morning and having an idea, or having one walking down the street. That's the most important part of the job, and it doesn't involve words.
It's funny, I was doing a little editing for one of these anthologies, and I got a short story from C.J. Box. And at the back of the short story, he didn't realize he'd left it. It was his outline. And it was really fascinating because he wrote this very detailed outline, but also, in reading the finished story, I saw where he departed from it, And I was going to ask you, Jeff, do you, because your plots are so tight and perfectly constructed, do you ever find during the writing process you write yourself out of your outline?
Very little. Because I spend so much time on the outline, and I've been doing this for 35 years now, and I kind of have the technique down. I know what should go in, what shouldn't. If there's any variation, it's generally that I kill too many people. This is being recorded in the outline because less is more, really, and you don't need a high body count. You can get, I think, a little more emotional impact by cutting down a little bit. So I think that's the most consistent thing I've done. I pulled back from that, but generally it's like 98% what the outline looks like.
Good question. When, for either one, when you start writing your books, and like you said, you've already mapped out books coming in the future, how far along are you when you're writing the current book? Do you start thinking about the other books? Do you sometimes have ideas for other books that are, as you're going along with this book, that
Should I repeat
you
the
need to
question
set
for you guys? Yeah. What was it again? Ed?
Do you have
Basic.
Okay, go ahead.
Basically, when you start writing your books, when you're through into the process, maybe halfway through or so, do you start getting ideas for future books, either pertaining to what you're writing, like a follow-up, or something entirely different? How does that happen a lot? Do you?
I have a document with about 10 book ideas in it, and I'm continually going into that document and expanding on a book idea or changing the title. Those stories are occurring to me constantly, and I also go down quite a long road with some books that I never end up writing. So I'm in and out of a bunch of books, and that's one of the reasons why I'm slow at this. It will be 3 years. It's 3 years between this book and my last book, and during that time, I wrote large chunks of 2 other books. And in fact, when I went to Paris in 2016, I had my computer, and I was like a third of the way through a completely different book that is now sitting in my drawer, as it were, while I started writing this other book. And I don't know if I'm ever going to get back to writing that novel, but I'm perfectly willing to take a few months of work and simply put it aside if I think I have better ideas. Again, I'm not trying to write as many books as possible. I'm only trying to write the book right now that I can make the best book I can write right now. And I think that involves giving up on projects when something better comes along, or when I simply realize this is just not going to be a great book, and I don't want to publish any of those.
Basically the same answer for me. I have a big idea file, and I return to it quite often, and some never see the light of day. Fortunately, there are others there that I can turn to. I have my writing the new Culture Shaw book. The outline is done. I'm in the process of writing that. I have the Lincoln Rhyme book for 2021. That's the outline is done. I have the Catherine Dance book all outlined, and my third Culture Shaw book is outlined as well in very rough form. And I find it's very, when I get tired of putting the prose on the paper, which I find the difficult part, I like the outlining more, and I like the editing. So once the book is written, the heavy lifting. So when I'm tired of writing the prose, then it's kind of fun for me to turn to the outline for another book, and that's kind of the dessert for the day, and I'll do that and jump back and forth.
I just came up with a book idea now, which is that one of you holds Jeffrey Deaver's file hostage with all of his book ideas and demands a very large ransom.
It's called ransomware, and but Putin's already done that. So, I wasn't going to talk politics. I'm sorry.
Maybe one or two last questions here.
Just a simple question. You keep talking about writing. Do you deliberately take pen to paper, or do you compose on the computer? This question is for both of you.
In my case, I touch type, so I type on a computer. I have tried longhand, and it's too slow for me. And the ideas kind of get bottlenecked. I tried dictating, and I don't have any skill for that. And what I produce at dictating is pretty much garbage. So there's just something about the delay, the thought, the typing, and going onto the screen works for me.
I only type.
You type with a typewriter.
No, a computer.
No, you talked about a typewriter. That's why I asked this question.
I guess I grew up typing on a typewriter, and so I still occasionally refer to the act as, but no.
I was corrected once by someone. I said, yeah, I type out my books, and she said, do you use a typewriter? I said, no, I use a computer. She said, well, then your keyboard. I said, yes, ma'am.
Hashtag smug.
So my question is for Jeff, I have two. When you do the outline and it's an electronic outline on your computer, when you type the prose, do you literally start writing over your outline and then just develop the story from the outline as you go, or do you have the outline next to you on another computer and then you start writing?
I have two documents in front of me, two big books, basically, three whole notebook things. One is the outline, and the other is my research. And the outline will have on it a notation, and it would be like R37. And that refers to the R for research, page 37 of the research, because at that point in the outline, which might be chapter 5, I need information, I'm making this up entirely, but Lincoln Rhyme has a clue that involves mustard. So I turn to page 37 of my research, it's the history of mustard. Now, like Chris, you don't want to put all that research in, you don't want to slow the story down, but I need a little tidbit about mustard. So I have one book here, one book there, and then the computer in front of me. And I will say, I do touch type, so I don't need to look at the key. So sometimes, and actually when I write, I close my eyes, or shut the light out, or generally close my eyes, and envision the scene, and then I just type. But a word of advice, if you want to do that, you know those little bumps on the F and the H keys, or whatever they are? Make sure they're under your fingers, because if you don't, you're going to get something encrypted that, frankly, only Putin's FSB can decrypt. Don't brought up politics again. I'm sorry, did you have another one?
Yeah, I do have another one. Have you considered or thought of or rejected writing a prequel to Lincoln Rhyme, i.e. when he was very young and first starting out before he suffered his injuries and what his life was like then?
Yes, I have. The question was if you heard about a prequel to the Lincoln Rhyme books. The only problem with that is that it would have to be without Amelia Sachs, and she is almost as popular as he is. I have thought about doing a paired chapter book, so chapter 1, 3, 5, 7 Lincoln, chapter 2, 4, 6, and so forth is Amelia. And then I actually thought, I'm kind of giving this away, but it's an idea that is in that file. And what's the last chapter? Him going to the crime scene where he was injured, and if you're not familiar with them, a cop very badly injured at a crime scene, and that we know that the bone collector would come next. So I have thought about that, but I haven't gotten around to that yet.
She'd like the royalty.
What's that?
She'd like the royalty.
She would.
All right, let's just do one more question. Anybody have a burning one? All right.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
Patty and Dennis say hello.
Oh, hi. I just saw them the other day.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you were mentioning that this new TV series, you weren't aware of it coming about, and I know that you sold the movie rights. I guess that's why. But are they allowed to use all your Lincoln Rhyme books without your permission?
Yeah. Well, it's not without my permission. I gave my permission, and they paid very generously some years ago, and that was a situation that I know Chris has dealings with Hollywood too, and here's how the conversation went. Jeff, we want to buy out Lincoln Rhyme, make a movie with Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie, and we will make a TV series too for this amount of money, and it was quite generous. And I said, what's the other option? We don't make it. So I didn't have much option there. And you know, the fact is, I'm not involved in it. I love movies, I love TV shows, but we get to sit in dark rooms and write books and tell our stories the way we want. It's not a project by committee. We have wonderful people who help us, like your reader and our editors and so forth. But it's like 99% our product. That's not true in Hollywood. And so I don't play well with others. That's why I don't co-write. Nothing wrong with it. I know James Patterson. I respect what he does. He gets millions of people to read books. I just can't really do that. So the Hollywood stuff, it's for me, it's kind of like PR. Thank you.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Well, thank you.
And,
Thank you so much.
Thank you all too. And those of you who purchase a book should have a ticket with a number in it, and it will form a line by number. And if you wouldn't mind folding up your chairs and just putting it against the closest wall. Thank you very much.
Number 4. Okay. Grab that start. Number 1. 2. Okay, right here. I'm number 4. Oh. Thank you.
Can you, Julie, can you grab a couple of slides?
That's the loneliest number. I got up at 4 this morning. Oh, really? Yeah. Sure. How are you? Good to see you. Good. Yeah. I have my group of friends who come here. I really like it. So.
Last time.